It's the summer of 1866, and the oil business is on fire. For 2 years, the oil fields of Pennsylvania have been pumping out more crude than the market can swallow. What was selling for over $6 a barrel now slides toward 2 and then lower. Refiners are panicking. Bankers are pulling loans. Men who thought they'd be oil kings are about to be debtors. John D. Rockefeller is only 27. His refinery in Cleveland isn't the biggest, and his fortune is still measured in tens of thousands, not millions. This crash could wipe him out just like everyone else. But here's where ambition shows its real face. Most people think ambition is raw hunger, that unending drive to keep pushing forward. But Rockefeller sees it differently. Ambition is only useful if it survives impact, and that means adapting your game when the rules change overnight. He studies the wreckage around him. The small refiners are leveraged to the hilt. Their equipment is decent, but their management is sloppy. They can't pay workers. They can't service loans. Every day they hang on, their debt deepens. Rockefeller does something that seems almost insane in a market collapse. He starts buying. He doesn't buy recklessly. He buys like a chess player, selecting plants that can be modernized quickly, negotiating for machinery at pennies on the dollar, taking over contracts that still have life in them. Because he has run his business conservatively, low debt, precise accounts, tight cost control, he's one of the few with both cash and credit left to act. In one deal, he takes over a refinery for less than the value of its inventory. In another, he trades future delivery of refined kerosene for the deed to a plant. Competitors see disaster. Rockefeller sees a clearance sale. The newspapers call it a bust year for oil. Rockefeller calls it a year of gathering. But the move isn't just financial. It's psychological. While others retreat into survival mode, he sends a signal. I'm still building. That unnerves competitors. Some start approaching him instead of fighting him, hoping to sell out before they're swallowed whole. By the time prices stabilize, Rockefeller's network of refineries is far larger than before the crash. The same disaster that destroyed dozens of oil men has just catapulted him into the top tier of the industry. Here's the lesson. When the market turns against you, you can't just hold on and hope for a rebound. The ones who grow during a collapse are the ones who walk toward the wreckage and start salvaging. Rockefeller's ambition wasn't about blind optimism. It was about positioning himself so that fear in others became opportunity for him. The oil crash of 1866 could have ended his career before it began. Instead, it became the foundation for the empire he would build. And that was no accident. He had trained himself to see a downturn not as the end of the road, but as the opening of the gates. If you want to see how quickly ambition can turn into scandal, look no further than 1872. Rockefeller is now in his early 30s. His refineries are humming, his finances are disciplined, and his appetite for control is only growing. But in business, growth depends on leverage. And in oil, the greatest leverage sits with the railroads. Whoever controls the rails controls the flow of crude and kerosene. Rockefeller and a handful of other major refiners quietly hatch a plan, the South Improvement Company. On paper, it's an association designed to stabilize shipping rates. In reality, it's a deal that gives Rockefeller massive rebates, preferential rates for Standard Oil shipments, plus secret drawbacks on the shipments of his competitors. That means every barrel his rivals move actually feeds money back into his pocket. From a purely strategic view, it's brilliant. He'd lower his costs, squeeze out inefficiency, and quietly consolidate even more refining capacity. But here's the problem. Secrecy only works until someone talks. Word leaks. The oil producers in Pennsylvania find out that refiners like Rockefeller have cut a backroom deal that will strangle them. Outrage erupts. In the oil regions, crowds gather. Small refiners denounce him as a tyrant. Riots break out around Titusville. Newspapers thunder about corruption, monopoly, and betrayal. Overnight, Rockefeller is branded the villain of the oil world. It looks like a fatal mistake. The government threatens investigations. Angry mobs demand the South Improvement Company be destroyed. For a young empire builder, this kind of public fury could end everything. But here's where Rockefeller shows a different side of ambition. When to retreat. He doesn't dig in his heels or insist on forcing the deal through. He recognizes that ambition isn't about dying on the wrong hill. So the South Improvement Company is dissolved almost as quickly as it was born. The contracts are shredded, the official story buried. But Rockefeller doesn't waste the scandal. While the public is venting, he's moving quietly in the background. Competitors, shaken by the backlash and uncertain of the future, begin to lose their nerve. Many of them, exhausted by the chaos, come to him with offers. Buy me out. Take over my plant. The beauty is that Rockefeller now has a new reputation. He's feared. The very scandal that looked like a career-ending disaster turns him into the man everyone assumes will win in the end. If you can't beat him, the logic goes, you might as well sell to him. By the end of 1872, Rockefeller has absorbed 22 out of 26 Cleveland refiners. A city once filled with rivals is now practically a Standard Oil colony. What the mobs thought was his defeat turned into his consolidation victory. The lesson here is ambition doesn't mean you never make mistakes. It means you know how to turn your worst blunders into leverage. Rockefeller's plan backfired in public, but he converted the fallout into momentum. That's the kind of ambition that endures. The kind that survives scandal by bending, not breaking. The year is 1873, and the American economy suddenly shatters. A major banking house, J. Cook and Company, collapses under the weight of railroad speculation. In days, credit dries up, the stock market plunges, and businesses across the country fold. The newspapers call it a panic. For Rockefeller, it could be a death sentence. Standard Oil is still young. He has been expanding rapidly, buying up refineries, securing rail deals, and stretching his reach. A financial panic means bankers slam their vaults shut. Competitors can't refinance. Even solvent firms get crushed when lenders call in loans. In moments like this, ambition usually gets humbled. But Rockefeller had been preparing for years for just this kind of storm. He was a master of caution in the middle of aggression. While his rivals loaded themselves with debt, dreaming of endless profits, Rockefeller built slowly, always keeping more liquidity than anyone thought necessary. He watched every cent, his books balanced with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. So when the panic arrives, Standard Oil doesn't collapse. It sharpens its knives. Refineries across the country, once proud and booming, are now desperate for cash. Workers can't be paid. Equipment sits idle. Owners whisper about shutting their doors. Rockefeller moves in, not as a vulture, but as a farmer harvesting at the season everyone else fears. He buys plants for pennies on the dollar. He offers stock in Standard Oil to competitors who can't keep up. Some sell willingly, grateful for a lifeline. Others sell bitterly, knowing they have no choice. The panic becomes his conveyor belt of acquisitions. Each deal strengthens his hold over refining capacity. By the time the smoke clears, Rockefeller hasn't just survived the crash, he has vaulted ahead. There's a story that during these years he would sometimes walk to work humming hymns, while others were wringing their hands. That wasn't arrogance. It was the calm of a man who had positioned himself to turn fear into fuel. This is the hidden lesson of ambition. It's not about constant forward motion. It's about preparation for the days when the world collapses around you. If you're unprepared, ambition gets wiped out by panic. But if you've built discipline into your foundation, ambition becomes strongest when everyone else is weakest. Rockefeller himself put it bluntly, "He who saves controls." In 1873, while rivals begged for loans and cursed the economy, Rockefeller tightened his grip on the entire oil industry. His ambition had survived impact yet again, because he had designed it to. The panic broke thousands of businessmen. For Rockefeller, it forged the first true monopoly. By the late 1870s, Rockefeller's empire seems unstoppable. He controls most refining in Cleveland, dominates kerosene exports, and has the railroads under his thumb. But power always breeds rebellion. And this time, the rebellion comes in the form of pipelines. At first, pipelines are small, crude things. Wooden tubes running oil short distances to rail terminals. Rockefeller isn't worried. Standard Oil owns the refineries and the railroad contracts. What can a few pipes do? But ambition always meets its resistance. Independent producers in the Pennsylvania oil regions are tired of paying Rockefeller's shipping rates. They want freedom. Their solution? Bypass the rails altogether by laying miles of iron pipeline directly from wells to markets. For Rockefeller, this is a direct threat. If the producers succeed, his rebate deals with the railroads will be worthless. Worse, his control over the flow of oil, the very bloodstream of his empire, could be broken. The revolt spreads. New companies form with names like Tidewater Pipeline. Investors back them. Crews lay pipe through forests and hills, building a rival system. The press cheers them on as heroes fighting the octopus of Standard Oil. For the first time, Rockefeller looks vulnerable. And here is where ambition meets another test. How do you respond when technology changes the battlefield? He doesn't panic. He studies. He realizes pipelines aren't just a threat, they're the future. Fighting them outright would waste time and money. So he adapts. Standard Oil quietly begins building its own pipelines. At the same time, he uses every tool at his disposal, negotiating with some independents, suing others, and when the chance arises, buying stakes in the very lines meant to oppose him. The result? Within a few years, the pipeline revolution that was supposed to break Standard Oil instead extends its power. Rockefeller still controls the refining bottleneck, and now he's securing the arteries that feed it. His rivals dreamt of freedom and ended up laying the groundwork for his next monopoly. Ambition that can adapt dies with the first disruption. Rockefeller's ambition didn't cling to the old rail system. It absorbed the new threat, turned it into an asset, and folded it back into his empire. By the early 1880s, the pipeline revolt has fizzled. Tidewater survives, but weakened. Standard Oil controls not just the refining of oil, but much of its transportation, whether by rail, river, or pipe. The very rebellion that looked like the beginning of his end becomes another rung in his ladder. Rockefeller's genius was not that he avoided threats. It was that he turned threats into tools. Ambition, in his hands, wasn't fragile. It was liquid, able to flow into whatever container reality provided. For decades, Rockefeller had built his empire in the shadows. He was famous for silence. No speeches, no flashy interviews, no public show of wealth. His name almost never appeared in print. But in 1902, a voice rose that he couldn't silence, a voice that would turn his reputation upside down. That voice belonged to Ida Tarbell, a journalist with a personal grudge. Her father had been ruined by Standard Oil's ruthless tactics back in Pennsylvania. Now she had the platform of McClure's magazine, one of the most widely read publications in America, and she aimed her pen directly at Rockefeller. Tarbell began publishing a serialized investigation, the history of the Standard Oil Company. Month after month, her words stripped the mask off his empire. She described secret rebates, hidden takeovers, intimidation of rivals, and the crushing weight of monopoly. Her prose painted Rockefeller not as a builder, but as a predator. The public devoured it. Each issue was a sensation. The fallout was immediate. Ordinary Americans who had admired Standard's efficiency and cheap kerosene now saw Rockefeller as a villain. The octopus became the symbol of corporate greed. Cartoons and newspapers showed Standard's tentacles strangling farmers, workers, and the capital itself. For Rockefeller, this wasn't just bad publicity, it was dangerous. Public opinion shapes politics, and politics controls the courts. Tarbell's exposé gave fuel to the growing antitrust movement. The walls were closing in. Now, most men with his ambition might have fought back with public statements, lawsuits, or attempts to smear Tarbell, but Rockefeller understood something deeper. Fighting a journalist in the open only multiplies her power. Instead, he retreated even further into silence. He let his executives handle denials. He gave no speeches. He allowed Standard's philanthropy, funding universities, research, and public health, to do the quiet talking for him. It was a paradoxical move, attacked louder than ever before. Rockefeller became quieter than ever before. And that very silence created a strange effect. To his enemies, it confirmed his image as the cold, calculating monopolist. But to his allies, it showed discipline, a refusal to be rattled. Behind the scenes, Rockefeller adapted again. He shifted more of his focus from oil to philanthropy. If his business reputation was now tainted, his legacy could still be reshaped through giving. While Tarbell was writing of corruption, Rockefeller was funding medical research that would wipe out diseases. Ambition isn't always about fighting. Sometimes the best move is to absorb the blow and redirect your energy into another field of influence. Tarbell bruised his reputation, but she couldn't kill his empire. And ironically, the heat of her attack may have pushed him faster into the philanthropic mission that secured his place in history. When ambition is attacked, the instinct is to defend. Rockefeller's instinct was to build elsewhere. That's why his empire endured. By the dawn of the 20th century, Standard Oil was the most powerful corporation in America. It refined nearly 90% of the nation's oil, controlled pipelines and railroads, and had tentacles reaching from Pennsylvania to China. To Rockefeller, it was simply efficiency on a grand scale. To the public, it looked like tyranny, and in 1906, the U.S. government decided it was time to strike. The Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit under the Sherman Act, accusing Standard Oil of illegal restraint of trade and monopolization. For Rockefeller, now in his late 60s, this was the gravest threat yet. Courtrooms are not markets. You can't outbid a judge or buy time from the law. The empire he had spent 40 years constructing was suddenly at risk of being dismantled by government decree. The case dragged on for years. Witnesses testified about secret rebates, predatory pricing, and coercive tactics. Newspapers covered every detail, feeding the public a steady diet of anti-standard outrage. Critics called for blood. Standard's very name became synonymous with monopoly. Most businessmen would have fought to the bitter end, clinging to their empire, burning resources in the hope of a reprieve. But Rockefeller's ambition was not about stubborn possession. It was about multiplication. He understood a paradox few could see. Sometimes losing the structure can increase the value. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled. Standard Oil was to be dissolved, split into 34 independent companies. To the press, it was a triumph. The octopus had been slain. Crowds cheered the victory of justice over greed. But look closer. Rockefeller held massive shares in Standard Oil. When it broke into pieces, those shares transformed into stakes in every new company. Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Amoco, Conoco, and more. Within a year, the combined value of those shares had doubled. Rockefeller, once condemned as the monopolist, suddenly became the richest man in the world by an even greater margin. The government thought it had humbled him. In reality, it had handed him the largest single payday of his career. His ambition didn't just survive the blow, it fed on it. Ambition isn't about clinging to one form of power. It's about positioning yourself so that even in defeat, you win. Rockefeller didn't fight the breakup to the death. He let it happen because he had already calculated that his wealth and his influence would expand regardless of the outcome. What looked like a death sentence became a final consolidation of fortune. The empire was broken, but the man at the center walked away stronger than ever. Ambition, at its highest level, isn't destroyed by external force. It bends, adapts, and transforms setbacks into accelerators. The 1911 breakup proved it. Even when stripped of his monopoly, Rockefeller's ambition turned loss into the ultimate victory. For all his victories in business, Rockefeller could not dominate one battlefield: his own body. By the late 1870s, while still in his 30s, he began to show signs of breaking down. His nerves frayed. He suffered insomnia, digestive issues, and headaches that seemed to arrive with every surge of stress. At one point, clumps of his dark hair began falling out until his head was almost bare. To the outside world, he looked calm and unshakable. Behind closed doors, he was a man pushed to the edge. Most businessmen of his era drove themselves until they collapsed, and many never recovered. But Rockefeller's ambition was different. He didn't treat the breakdown as an ending. He treated it as data, feedback that his system needed redesigning. If his body could not sustain endless pressure, then he would build a new way of living that could. He began restructuring his life with the same precision he brought to Standard Oil. He delegated more. He reduced his working hours. He controlled his diet with almost fanatical care, often eating the same simple meals day after day. He set aside time for long walks, golf, and quiet reading. He enforced a rhythm of rest and order, almost like a machine being recalibrated. This was not weakness. It was strategy. Rockefeller understood that ambition without sustainability is self-destruction. His rivals burned themselves out chasing every opportunity, while he built a system that could last decades. His nervous collapse became the trigger for a more disciplined, more balanced form of control. He also leaned into faith. Raised by a devout mother, Rockefeller now relied on his religious convictions to steady his nerves. Prayer and scripture gave him a framework for patience and long-term trust. Ambition became less about urgent conquest and more about consistent stewardship. By his 40s, the visible signs of strain had faded. He regained composure, his baldness hidden under a signature cap, his posture calm. He still worked, but in a different way. Not by personally carrying the empire, but by orchestrating it from a higher vantage point. He was the conductor, not the entire orchestra. The lesson here cuts deeper than any financial victory. Ambition must adapt not only to markets, but to the limits of the human body. If you destroy yourself chasing success, you lose the very vessel through which ambition operates. Rockefeller's brilliance was to treat his health crisis as another kind of business problem, one that required restructuring, patience, and the discipline to say no to overextension. His nervous breakdown could have ended him before Standard Oil reached its peak. Instead, it became the pivot that allowed him to lead for another 40 years. Ambition, once again, survived impact, not by force, but by redesign. Building an empire demands sacrifices, and often the people closest to the builder carry the heaviest weight. For Rockefeller, the battlefield wasn't only in oil fields, courtrooms, or boardrooms. It was also inside his home. He married Laura Spelman in 1864, a woman of deep faith and strong moral conviction. She became his anchor, but even anchors strain under pressure. As Standard Oil grew, Rockefeller's life revolved around ledgers, strategy sessions, and endless negotiations. His obsession with order and control sometimes spilled into his family life. He expected discipline, frugality, and self-control from his children in the same way he demanded them from employees. For his wife, it meant living in the shadow of one of the most ambitious men of the century. Their home was comfortable but never ostentatious, reflecting his lifelong obsession with thrift. Yet the sheer intensity of his ambition often left Laura managing the household and children largely on her own. She supported him, but the distance between their worlds was real. The greatest test came with the children themselves. Rockefeller wanted heirs who could carry on not just his fortune, but his philosophy. But raising children under the weight of one of the largest fortunes in history is no easy task. They lived with a constant contradiction. Their father insisted on modesty and simplicity, yet the world saw them as symbols of unimaginable wealth. Some of his children chafed under the pressure. John D. Rockefeller Jr., his only son, felt both the burden of expectation and the suffocating shadow of his father's discipline. At times, the relationship grew tense. Jr. admired his father but wrestled with the feeling that nothing he did could measure up. The ambition that fueled Rockefeller's empire building risked fracturing the family that was supposed to inherit it. Here again, Rockefeller adapted. Just as he had restructured Standard Oil after setbacks, he slowly restructured his role as a father. Instead of crushing his children under the full weight of his ambition, he redirected it. He involved them in philanthropy, making charitable work not just his passion but theirs. Junior in particular would go on to become one of the greatest philanthropists of the 20th century. Not by building railroads or refineries, but by building institutions, parks, and cultural landmarks. What looked like a strain became in time a transfer. The same ambition that had threatened to divide the family became the glue that bound them in a new mission. Rockefeller realized that if his empire was to survive beyond him, his children had to see ambition not only as conquest, but as stewardship. Ambition without balance can destroy a family. But if you learn to redirect it, to give your loved ones a stake in the mission, rather than just the pressure of it, ambition becomes generational. Rockefeller nearly lost that battle, but by adapting, he ensured that his legacy would not die with Standard Oil, but live through the Rockefellers themselves. By the turn of the century, Rockefeller had reached the peak of wealth. Adjusted for today, he was worth hundreds of billions. For most men, the story would end there. Accumulate, preserve, and pass on the fortune. But for Rockefeller, ambition never froze. It transformed. and its new form was philanthropy. Giving away money sounds simple. Write checks, build libraries, donate to churches. But Rockefeller didn't think like an ordinary giver. He treated philanthropy as another arena of business, a system to be engineered, scaled, and made permanent. He wasn't content with scattered acts of charity. He wanted to restructure society the way he had restructured the oil industry. At first, the public scoffed. Many thought his giving was just reputation laundering, a way to wash off the stain of Standard Oil's ruthless tactics. Critics mocked his dimes, those small coins he handed out to children and strangers. But behind the dimes was a grander vision. Rockefeller was testing the habit of giving, not just the scale of it. Then came the big moves. He created the General Education Board, which transformed Southern schools. He funded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, a pioneering force in modern medicine. Later, the Rockefeller Foundation would bankroll breakthroughs in public health, eradicating diseases like hookworm and yellow fever. These weren't random gifts. They were investments with careful research, accountability, and long-term structure. But here was the gamble. Giving at this scale could have drained his influence. A less disciplined man might have been left hollow, his empire of wealth diluted into endless requests and wasteful projects. Rockefeller avoided that trap by applying the same principles he used in business: efficiency, control, and long horizons. He professionalized philanthropy. He made it scientific. The impact was staggering. Instead of fading into history as just another tycoon, Rockefeller reshaped the very idea of what it meant to be rich. He showed that ambition didn't have to die once you won the economic game. It could evolve into the ambition to heal, to educate, to elevate entire nations. Ambition is not just about taking, it's about creating structures that outlast you. If Rockefeller had clung to his money, he would have been remembered as a monopolist. By giving it strategically, he became a builder of institutions that still shape the world today. The philanthropy gamble could have left him weaker. Instead, it extended his power beyond his lifetime. His ambition leapt from the oil fields of Pennsylvania to the laboratories, universities, and hospitals of the world. In doing so, Rockefeller proved that true ambition doesn't just accumulate wealth, it transforms it into a force that keeps multiplying long after the man himself is gone. By the time Rockefeller reached his 80s, the man who once terrified rivals and humbled railroads no longer ran Standard Oil. The empire was gone, broken up by the Supreme Court. His fortune, though larger than ever, was largely in the hands of managers, lawyers, and heirs. To most men, this would be the end. What is ambition without an empire? But Rockefeller's ambition never depended solely on titles or offices. In his later years, he shifted again, proving that the engine inside him could run even when the external machinery was dismantled. He reinvented ambition as lifestyle, as legacy, and as stewardship. He built a daily routine of discipline. He rose early, ate modest meals, and scheduled his life with the precision of an accountant. Golf became his obsession, not as leisure, but as a ritual of self-control. He kept score meticulously, tracking improvement, turning a simple game into another arena for order and mastery. Where others saw an old man at play, Rockefeller saw one more system to perfect. He also deepened his philanthropy. By this point, he had already poured hundreds of millions into universities, medical research, and public health. But now his energy went into ensuring these institutions would endure without him. He designed boards, charters, and structures so that his money would not simply be spent, but multiplied in impact. His life's work became less about owning companies and more about shaping the DNA of foundations that would outlive him by centuries. Family, too, became a focus. The strains of earlier years softened into a more reflective role. He worked to pass down not just wealth, but habits, thrift, discipline, faith. He wanted his children and grandchildren to inherit a way of thinking, not just a fortune. Whether they embraced it fully or not, he was determined to plant the seed. And there was still the public. Even in his 90s, Rockefeller would appear in newspapers handing out dimes to children, smiling beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Critics sneered that it was eccentric, even manipulative. But behind the gesture was a message. Ambition isn't always about colossal moves. Sometimes it's about consistency, the daily habit of giving, no matter how small. When he died in 1937 at the age of 97, Rockefeller had lived through every phase ambition could face: collapse, scandal, revolt, lawsuits, breakdown, and finally the slow surrender of power to time itself. And through every stage, ambition adapted. From empire building to crisis management to philanthropy to legacy, it never disappeared. It simply shifted form. The final lesson is this: true ambition isn't tied to one career, one company, or even one lifetime. It's a way of thinking that finds new outlets as circumstances change. Rockefeller turned ambition into wealth, then wealth into power, then power into legacy. Even stripped of his empire, he remained the embodiment of ambition until the day he died. Rockefeller's story shows us something uncomfortable. Ambition often isolates. The higher he climbed, the fewer equals he found. Competitors became enemies. Friends became rivals. Even family sometimes struggled to understand his drive. And isn't that the truth for many of us? If you're ambitious, you know the feeling. Most people around you don't get it. They think you're obsessed or restless or too hard on yourself. They can't see why you refuse to settle. And slowly, ambition can become a lonely road. But it doesn't have to be. Rockefeller proved that ambition doesn't die when it collides with pressure. It grows stronger when it's channeled into systems, partnerships, and vision. And the same is true for us today. The key is finding others who live at your speed, who speak the same language of drive, discipline, and long-term vision.